Chapter 17: Communication in Organizations. The learning objectives of this chapter will include a description of the interpersonal nature of organizations, an understanding of the role and importance of communication in the manager's job, and identification of the basic forms of communication in organizations. We will also look at informal communication, which includes various forms of informal communication and their types, and how the communication process can be managed to recognize and overcome barriers. Interpersonal dynamics. You find out that organizations continually look for ways to improve communication among their employees, customers, and other stakeholders, right? When you come to interpersonal dynamics, at one extreme of such a dynamic, you find out that interpersonal relations can be personal and positive, or they can be personal and negative. Now, on the extreme of personal and positive, this happens when the employees involved or the parties involved know each other. They have mutual respect and affection for each other, and they enjoy interactions, right? Or they enjoy interacting with each other, right? But the other extreme, which is personal interpersonal dynamic, which is negative, this happens when the parties dislike each other, they do not have mutual respect for one another or for each other, and they do not enjoy interacting, right? So most interactions within organizations fall between these two extremes rather, and the focus is on interaction in a professional way in order to achieve what the goals and objectives of the organization is or are, right? Now, outcomes of interpersonal behavior. One of the outcomes of such behaviors will be need satisfaction, right? Interpersonal relations in organization can be a primary source of social needs, whereby interactions can be an important positive element in the workplace because it helps satisfy what needs the employee or the employees involved in interaction have, right? Now, you also have the social support, whereby good interpersonal relations can become a source of synergy or a source of social support, right? Others, where people share a common frame of reference. Now, you also have, it could be, one of the outcomes could be conflict, such interpersonal behaviors, especially when it's personal and negative, then the outcome or the result could be a conflict situation whereby there's an exchange of anger or hostility. So, from a managerial perspective, strong interpersonal relationships with employees allow managers to actually know how employees will react to specific challenges, yeah, where their strengths lie, and what strategies that may be required to motivate these employees for them to be successful in their job roles or job functions. Definition of communication. Communication is the process of transmitting information from one person to another. Now, effective communication is the process of sending a message in such a way that the message received by the recipient is as close in meaning as possible to the message intended by the sender. Effective communication is also based on the ideas of meaning and the consistency of meaning. So you find out that a key element in effective communication is the distinction between data and information, whereby data are raw figures and facts reflecting a single aspect of reality, whereas information will be data presented in a way or form that it has meaning, right? So information will be data that has meaning. The role of communication in management. So generally, information is useful only if it is accurate, timely, complete, and relevant, right? So communication should be accurate in the sense that it provides a valid and reliable reflection of reality, right? So you find out that it's just like information systems where you hear the word like garbage in, garbage out. So if you feed in wrong information into such an information system, at the point of retrieval of the information, it can never give you accurate information based off what you fed it, right? So if you feed it garbage, then it's gonna give you garbage when you try to retrieve information. So providing a valid and reliable reflection of reality, which is accuracy of information at the point of input, is necessary for that information to be correct at the point of retrieval or at the point where someone else is trying to receive such information, right? Now, information communication should be timely in the sense that it's available in time for appropriate managerial action or decision making, right? So you find out that there's a specified period for course enrollment where you can add or drop your classes, right? That's about timeliness, right? Having to do things when there's the appropriate time. So the school can actually make sufficient arrangements when you're dropping a class or when you're adding a class. It allows for managerial decision making so that the organization works most effectively, right? Now, talking about the completeness of information, this provides the manager with all the information that he or she requires for decision making, right? It gives the manager all the facts and the details. Now, talking about the relevance of information, right? So communication should be relevant in the sense that that information is useful to managers in their particular circumstance for their and suiting their particular needs, right? So it's directly applicable to the manager's needs at that particular time or the circumstance in which the manager found themselves, right? So you find out that student expectation from a course or class, seeking that information at the beginning of the class, what are your expectations, is relevant because it actually helps me to provide information that is relevant towards your expectation in the class, if that makes sense. So communicating what information is relevant to you, or rather communicating the needs or student expectation in the class, helps for what information I pass across towards the student or across to the students. Further on the role of communication in management. So on this slide, you have a list of all the management functions that are impacted by communication. And you can see that the four managerial functions that are being discussed in this class, which is planning and decision making, organizing, controlling, and leading, they are part of those management functions that require effective communication. The communication process. Now, there are 5 steps in the communication process. 5 steps that we will be discussing, right? And the first is deciding, right? The first step, which is deciding to transmit a fact, idea, opinion, or other information to a receiver or to the receiver, right? So you find out that the communication process begins with when one person who is the sender wants to transmit this fact or idea or opinion or information to another person who is regarded as the receiver. Now, the second step is encoding, which is the meaning into is actually converting the fact into meaning into a form appropriate to the situation, right? Having to give the idea some meaning, right? Putting it in a form that is appropriate to the situation, whereby during the encoding step or the encoding step in the communication process, the sender actually encodes the message into an appropriate form. So the sender could actually decide to send the message as text, right? Encoding it as text or encoding it as numbers, or it could be in whatever form that actually serves the situation that allows for information to be passed on effectively. That would be what form of encoding the sender would adopt, right? Then the third step will be transmitting through the appropriate channel or medium, right? So the message in this step or rather during this step, the message is transmitted to the receiver through a channel, right? So it could be through a phone call, right? It could be through an email, a channel, right? So for instance, when I try to communicate with students in general, not privately, I can make announcements on Blackboard. So the Blackboard will be the channel for transmitting such information, right? Then you have the decoding, which is having to decode the message that was sent by the sender back into a form that has meaning to the receiver, right? So the message is received by the receiver and decoded at this step. Now you have noise. Noise is anything that actually disrupts rather the communication process, right? So the receiver the noise is anything that actually distorts the whole communication process, anything that actually derails the meaning that the receiver gets, which was originally intended by the sender. Anything that actually changes the meaning of such information will be considered as noise, right? So anything that disrupts the process would be noise, and it may be called interference. The diagram on this slide basically illustrates the communication process, right? And you can see where noises can actually come up in between those steps of the process. So noises can come up at most of those steps, right? From the point of encoding, there could be noise, right? If whatever encoding format the sender utilizes is not one that can be decoded by the receiver, that would create for noise, right? Also, you can see just from the diagram here the intervals or at what steps during the process of communication when noises could arise. Interpersonal communication. You find out that the kinds of communication that are common in organizations today include interpersonal communication, communication in networks and work teams, organizational communication, and digital communication, right? Now, interpersonal communication takes one of two forms, right? Generally, it could be oral or it could be written. Now, looking at oral communication form of interpersonal communication, this has to do with face-to-face conversation, group discussions, telephone calls, and other circumstances in which the spoken word is actually the form in which meaning or information is transmitted, right? So spoken word would be the form of encoding of this kind of communication when it's oral communication. Now you have the non-verbal communication, right? Whereby this is a communication exchange that does not use words or doesn't use words to carry more meaning than the strict definition of the words itself, right? So that would be non-verbal communication. Oral communication. You find out that oral communication has some advantages, which include it promotes prompt feedback, right, and interchange in the form of verbal questions or agreements, right, facial expressions and gestures, right. Oral communication is also easy and it can be done with little preparation, because I mean, as the words are coming, you can always be responding to them. But oral communication has its disadvantages, right? And they include that oral communication may suffer from problems of inaccuracy, right? If the speaker chooses the wrong words to convey meaning or leaves out pertinent details. So even when noise disrupts the process, right, it could actually be a disadvantage for oral communication. Or if the receiver forgets parts of the message, that is another disadvantage of oral communication. Then one other major disadvantage of oral communication is that there is no permanent record of what has been said. So there is nothing you can refer to, right, as basis of that the communication transpired, right, or that some form of interaction transpired between the parties that communicated. since there is no record of such communication. Non-verbal communication. Non-verbal communication does not use words to carry meaning, right? It relies on facial expressions, body movements, physical contact, proximity between communicators, and gestures, right? Now, there are three types of non-verbal communication that are practiced by managers. One will be the use of images, right? Which are words or phrases people elect to use. Now, settings would be boundaries, familiarity, or the home turf. Now, body language form of non-verbal communication would be about distance, eye contact, body and hand movement, pauses in speech, or mode of dress will be some form of communication too, as well, some form of non-verbal communication. And we find out that a study found that up to 55% of the content of a message is transmitted by facial expression and body movement, whereas about 38% from the inflection and tone of the words, right, or tone of the person who is communicating. Now, words themselves account for roughly 7% of the message. So you find out that a lot of the communication happens non-verbally, if that makes sense. Written communication. Written communication comes in form of memos, internal memos you find within organizations. It could come in form of letters. Letters are probably from organizations to outside organizations that they interface with. It could come in form of reports, right? It could come in form of organizational reports. It could come in form of notes that are left behind to probably indicate some request of some form, official request, right? It could come in form of emails that you send officially, or other circumstances in which the written word is used to transmit meaning, right? And there are some advantages to written communication, and it includes that written communication is often quite accurate and kind of provides a permanent record of the exchange or whatever interaction there was or communication between members of an organization, right? And it leaves time for thought and consideration. So, in written communication, you take a while to actually develop whatever it is you're trying to send out to some recipient, right? That gives you time to actually take time to give thought to whatever you're putting down or information you're trying to relay. And such information, because it is documented, because whatever recipient, whoever you're sending it to, has a copy of what you're sending to them, such information or such documents can always be referenced. They can always refer to it as something that you generated, right? And you find out that written communication is easy to use as well and can be done with little preparation, right? So, but you find out that these are the advantages, but there are downsides of written communication in organizations. And I'll tell you for free, as someone who has worked in the industry, I'll give you an advice. As much as possible, try not to put anything in writing when you're in the workplace. So, why you shouldn't put anything in writing, I'll give you reasons. First and foremost, it takes a while to make decisions for whatever you're putting in writing, because whatever you're sending out in writing, whoever the recipient is has to deliberate on what you have written to them and probably provides you some response in a written format as well. And that takes a while, as against you walking up to such individual within an organization or some individual outside the organization that you may be interfacing with. Rather than writing them, you meet them in person and go over your deliberations in person. That way you're able to get feedback or outcomes with regards to whatever it is you're trying to pass on or trying to get information on. So that would be one disadvantage of written communication, because of the time it takes for you to have feedback, right? And another thing about written communication, right, is that you find out that because it can be referred to, when you send out something, a document, it takes a while. People digest whatever you have written in that document and take a while to respond line by line. How do I mean? When I used to work in HR and we get some memos from members of staff, it could be memos seeking a position or seeking or trying to assert their position on a particular issue or situation. When it comes to us, we take our time to digest whatever information is put down there, versus if the person approached someone in HR to get some form of insight on what the decision making could be regarding such person's situation, right? If the person got such insight via oral communication, then such a person could refer to such oral communication when writing rather than writing ab initio. So you see, most times it may not be wise actually in the workplace to commit something into writing because it can always be referred to, if that makes sense. So, furthering our discussion or our thoughts on written communication, we'll be looking at the disadvantages, right? In as much as I may have shared some disadvantages in the earlier slide, right? So, the disadvantage would be that it inhibits feedback and interchange, right? And it's usually more difficult and time consuming than oral communication. So you find out that the feedback and interchange it inhibits is due to the burden of process of preparing a physical document. So it takes more time to prepare that physical document, and like I told you, when you send it out, whoever the recipient is, if they have to provide you feedback, they have to digest the information on your document and probably put whatever response in writing as well, right? So that actually inhibits the feedback process, if that makes sense, right? And this is referred to as message leanness, right? So you find out that having to have those challenges would be referred to as leanness. Now, considerable delay can occur in clarifying the message meanings, right? So, unlike when it's an oral communication, whoever you're interacting with or whoever you're passing information back and forth with can always clarify easily. But during written communication, the person has to write seeking for clarification even before they can respond to whatever information it is you're trying to pass on or probably trying to get, right? So you find out that first and foremost, a response in written communication would be even first of all seeking clarification, which causes some form of delay, right? So those delay will be lag time between the sending and the response. It can also result in inaccurate interpretation of the original meaning if the person decides to go ahead with responding without having to clarify what the message was all about, right? And like we said, it's difficult and time consuming. So like I told you before, right? For instance, if you were faced with a negotiation situation in an organization, or even when it's your organization interacting with another organization and you're faced with a negotiation situation, or even if it's on an individual basis, you may want to do so orally, right, before you commit it into writing. So whereby you're able to do those deliberations in person, and after that, when you have some form of position, a negotiated position, you can commit into writing so that it can be referred to afterwards. Choosing the right form of communication, right? So it depends. The situation determines the most appropriate medium of communication. There is no better form of communication. The situation actually determines which, right? Now, oral communication, which it comes in form of oral communication, right? In person. Emails or texts may be preferred, right? When the message is personal, when it's brief, when it's non-routine, or when it's high priority communications, right? Like if it's something that has some form of urgency to it, you may want to do that orally, right? Or maybe as text. So it's more like the text message may be responded to faster than maybe a memo, internal memo, right? Now, formal written communications also are usually the best when the message is more impersonal, when it is routine, and when it takes longer, right? When it can take longer, there's no urgency to such messages, right? Formal written communications like memos, letters, reports, and notes, right? When they are lower priority, when there's no urgency, they could be used. So managers basically should capitalize on the advantages of both forms of communication, right? They can make a phone call or send a text when they require some form of immediate responses, or they can as well, after doing those phone calls and text messages, they can also follow up in writing, like I told you, to document whatever conversations or whatever agreements that may have been arrived at during the telephone call. Communicating in networks and work teams. Communication network. This is the pattern through which the members of a group communicate, right, among themselves. Now, research suggests that for simple and routine tasks, centralized networks perform with the greatest efficiency and accuracy. But for complex and non-routine tasks, decentralized networks that have open communication are most effective, right? Now, when you come to communication network, you find out that also that research on communication networks have identified 5 basic networks for groups, right? And these 5 networks, they vary in terms of how the flow of information, the position of the leader of the group, and the effectiveness for different types of tasks. So you find out that most often than not, managers should strive to create centralized networks when group tasks are simple and routine. Alternatively, they can foster decentralized networks when group tasks are complex and non-routine. So the diagram on this slide basically illustrates those 5 basic networks, right? Those 5 basic types of communication networks that you find within organizations, right? You have the wheel, where the network, everybody kind of has some form of feedback from one particular person, individual, right? Where the individual has to communicate with every other member of the group. And you have the Y, where 2 individuals have to communicate to one individual who communicates to the rest of the group, right? So one individual is kind of the midpoint, or the kind of the liaison, or the kind of the connect between 2 other members on each side of the group, right? Then you have the chain, whereby you have the chain where one person passes to the other, and at each point in time, one member of the group could have some form of communication network with 2 members of the group once they are not the first and the last members of the group. Then you have the circle communication network and the all channel communication network. You may want to familiarize yourself with those basic network types that you have for 5-person groups within organizations. Vertical communication. Vertical communication is the communication that flows up and down the organization, usually along formal reporting lines, takes place between managers and their superiors, and as well as managers and their subordinates, and may involve several different levels of the organization, right? So you have 2 forms of vertical communication. You have the upward communication, which consists of messages from subordinates to superiors, and such messages are more subject to distortion, right? So the typical content of upward communication, since it emanates from subordinates to superiors, are basically requests from subordinates making requests of their superiors, right? And information that the lower level manager or the subordinate thinks is of importance to the higher level manager, right? That will be some form of upward communication. Now, upward communication also may be responses from the lower level manager to requests from the higher level manager. That will be an upward communication, where the higher level manager may be requested for some information that would enable their decision making, right? So those responses would be upward communication from the subordinate to the superior. Suggestions would equally fall under that. Complaints and even financial information, maybe trying to provide information on status, on what their operations are like within the group, right? So looking at the other arm of vertical communication, which is the downward communication, this occurs when information flows down the hierarchy from superiors to subordinates, right? Now, the typical content of these messages or this communication is probably directives, right, on how something is to be done within the group or in the organization. The assignment of new responsibilities will be some form of downward communication from the manager to their subordinates, right? Performance feedback, right, after appraisal or after performance evaluation, such feedback will be from the superior to the subordinate, and that's downward communication. Also, general information that higher level manager thinks will be of value to the lower level manager would also compose downward communication. So the diagram on this slide basically illustrates the formal communication within organizations, right? Basically highlighting the vertical communication, which we just discussed, the elements of it, the upward and downward, and also highlights the horizontal communication, which is captured in dotted lines, right, on this diagram, whereas the vertical communication is captured in unbroken lines. Horizontal communication. Horizontal communication is the communication that flows laterally within the organization, and it involves colleagues and peers at the same level of the organization and may involve individuals from several different organizational units, right? So such horizontal communication facilitates coordination among independent units within a group or within a department or within a function, right? It is also useful in joint problem solving, right? It could be problem solving that cuts across departments or work groups or business units. It could also play a major role in communication among members of work teams drawn from different departments. So when members of different work teams actually constitute a task group or a committee, then horizontal communication will be effective for actual coordination, right, among those people. For example, like when I used to work in the industry in HR, right, whenever the manpower planning and recruitment unit of the HR department recruited new staff, they made available information on new staff. There's such horizontal communication between the manpower unit and the staff information management unit within the same HR department. So the unit could capture the information of the new employee on our HR focus. So HR focus is our enterprise resource planning software, right? Our human resource planning software. So the staff information unit gets information which is communicated horizontally from the manpower planning and recruitment unit so that they can capture such information. And you find out that this staff information unit also makes available a comprehensive staff list. They communicate such information, that staff list, horizontally to the learning and development department unit of the HR department, so they can draw up trainings for all employees of the organization, right? So such communication, or even maybe some units in the HR department having to liaise with some units in the finance department with regards to eligibility of some employees for their allowances. Such communication most often than not happens at the horizontal communication level. It happens laterally among peers within the organization. Digital communication. So in digital communication, you find out that you have formal information systems, right? Or like I told you in the earlier slide, where I used to work in the industry, we had the HR focus, which was our information systems. It was a software that we used we utilized in capturing employee information, and it was such that we could also generate several types of reports or different types of reports from such a system, right? Through what we call the crystal report, we could manipulate or we could integrate several information contained on that software and come up with several reports, right, from that information system. So these formal information systems, under it you have IT management, and IT management includes the personnel like chief information officers who determine the information processing needs and requirements for the organization, right? Then you have what you call the personal electronic technology, right? It has created opportunities for quickly disseminating information and contacting others in the organization. And such technology includes the use of personal computers, right? Email networks, internet, intranets, social networking sites, social media platforms, and even other breakthroughs, even smartphones, right? So such technologies, right, has created opportunities for dysfunctional employee behaviors, because you find out that within organizations, employees tend to interact with these devices more than utilizing them for the job. They probably utilize it for personal purposes, like being on the social media. So those social media platforms, that would be a dysfunctional employee behavior, because that would be within the work time for which they should be making contributions to the organization, right? So under the personal electronic technology also, you have the personal digital technology, right, which includes the use of teleconferencing, smartphones like we mentioned, tablet computers, which are all enabled by Wi-Fi connections or local area network, right? So while these technologies facilitate communication, they also detract from face-to-face communication, which may impair organization's culture and working relationships among employees, right? The cohesion that exists when people are actually working in the office in person. And also, like we said earlier on, it creates avenues for dysfunctional employee behavior. Further on digital communication, we'll be looking at the advantages and disadvantages of digital communication, right? So the advantage would be that it allows people to work at home and transmit their work electronically to the company. So basically convenience, right? It helps for flexi work. It enables flexi working, if that makes sense. Now, but the disadvantages are perceived to be more than the advantages, and they include that there's the lack of face-to-face contact, right? The loss of strong personal relationships, loss of cohesion or synergy that happens more when people are in person. Now, falling behind professionally or losing out even on organizational politics, right? So you find out that these disadvantages may result in managers basically falling behind in the inner workings of the organization because they are not working from the office, right? So they drop out of the organizational grapevine and may even be victimized by office politics. Informal communication in organizations. So informal communication would include the interchanges among employees or interactions that happen among employees which actually take place outside the normal work setting, right? It may or may not follow official reporting relationships and may be prescribed by organizational channels, right? It may have nothing to do with official organizational business, and it can promote a strong culture and enhance employee understanding of how the organization works. So in Francis Marion University, for instance, in the School of Business, there is some initiative that was spearheaded by the School of Business, but it's usually open to members of faculty. I think first week of every Tuesday, right? Whereby it's called Tuesday Tunes. So for it, it has it follows official organizational channels, because usually such announcements are made through official communication channels, right? But it's an informal organizational setting where there's some form of communication, there's some form of cohesion, there's some form of promotion of strong culture of having some familiarity, encouraging some level of familiarity among employees of Francis Marion University, encouraging and fostering a strong bond, a strong relationship among faculty, right? So you find out that such initiatives or such avenues allow for informal communication. They may be formal organizational channels or informal organizational channels, right? But they all help or contribute towards promoting a strong culture and actually helping employees understand better how the organization works. Now, there are common forms of informal communications in organization, and they may include what you call the grapevine, right? There's also something called management by wandering around, and there's non-verbal communication. So the diagram on this slide is basically a representative of informal communication, and you can see that it's telling you that the communication isn't basically going through the formal reporting lines. It could cut across superiors, subordinates, peers, across departments, across the hierarchy. There is no formal channel, right? So it may or may not follow official reporting relationship. So the informal communication may still be along reporting lines, but not necessarily that they are about formal information or formal data is being passed on, but it may just be along the reporting line as well, right? So like we said, it doesn't have to be through the official reporting relationships, and it can occur across different levels and departments of work, and may or may not have anything to do with official business basically. The grapevine is an informal communication network among people in an organization, and it does not always follow the same patterns as formal channels of authority and communication, right? And it's been found to be most often than not 75 to 95% accurate, especially with information that is based on fact. Now, managers also can control but not eliminate information that is traveling through the grapevine. So, in summary, you find out that grapevine, like we said, can, as an informal communication network, it can permeate the entire organization. The two most common forms of grapevine that we have in organizations are what you call the gossip chain, where one person spreads the message or the information to many other people. And you also have what you call the cluster chain, right? Where one person spreads the information to a select few, and the select few keeps spreading to a select few. We'll see how that works in the diagram that follows, right? So in as much as the grapevine is seen as something that is negative, it's seen in the negative light within organizations, right? Because sometimes it's seen as gossip, more or less. Managers can also get valuable information from the grapevine and use it to improve their decision making, right? Because from the grapevine, for instance, if a manager wants to have feelers on how employees will respond to a particular change initiative, right? They can probably spread gossip or rumor through the grapevine that such a change initiative is about to be instituted by management of the organization, and based off that they will start having reactions from employees to actually get feelers from employees even before instituting such initiatives, right? So the managers can actually utilize grapevines to their benefit, if that makes sense. So the diagram on this slide, the two diagrams like we discussed earlier, are the common grapevine chains you find within organizations, right? The gossip chain, one person tells many, and the cluster chain, many people tell a few, right? And the cluster chain, it keeps progressing. That's how it spreads or permeates across the organization. Management by wandering around. This is another form of informal communication, right? That we already discussed the grapevine. This is a second form of informal communication within organizations. And management by wandering around is where managers keep in touch with what is going on by basically wandering around and having spontaneous conversations with others in the organization, right? And a related form of informal communication is the informal interchanges among employees that take place outside the workplace, right? So this management, by wandering around, encourages informal interchange that takes place outside normal work hierarchy. Barriers to communication. So you have the individual barriers to communication and the organizational barriers to communication, right? The individual barriers are those that are associated with the individual. They include conflicting or inconsistent signals, lack of credibility about the subject, reluctance to communicate, poor listening skills, and predispositions about the subject. So we understand that listening skill is actually a communication skill, ability to listen effectively, right? Not having even predispositions about what you're being told. That would equally feed into effective listening skills, right? So those poor listening skills would comprise or constitute individual barrier alongside all those that we mentioned, which are enumerated on this slide. Now, the organizational barriers are those barriers associated with the organization itself. They include semantics, right? What lingos do they use? And let me tell you how it's practical, right? Like within an organization, their different departments may have their different templates for writing internal memos, right? They may have different wordings for their memos, and when such departments interface, when they have communication, most likely through internal memos, there may be some communication gaps because the wordings or the templates for the internal memos differ across these departments, if that makes sense. So this will be an organizational barrier because there's no consistency across the departments with regards to semantics, if that makes sense. Now, you also have status or power differences, different perceptions, environmental factors such as noise or overload, right? And in multinational or multicultural firms, different languages that exist in their different institutional environments of operations, that would equally constitute an organizational barrier to communication. Improving communication effectiveness. Now, the individual skills for enhancing communication effectiveness include developing good listening skills, right? And to develop good listening skills is considered to be the single most important individual skill for improving communication effectiveness, right? Ability to listen effectively. It's the height of communication. Ability not to have predispositions, ability to listen, just listen without interjecting, without having a frame of mind, just listening. That is the most important individual skill, like we can even see on this slide, right? Another individual skill for enhancing communication would be to encourage two-way communication, right? So when you're communicating, ask questions to see if whoever you're interacting with is following, right? Like when a professor is in class, one way to find out if they are actually, whatever information they are relaying, that is being decoded effectively by the student, one way to find out would be to ask questions and see if students are able to provide the right answers to the questions, right? And also allow for feedback, right? That's another way to encourage two-way communication. Now, enhancing individual skills for enhancing communication. The third would be being aware of language and meaning, right? Meaning varies based on context and sender. Like we said, it could even differ across departments of an organization, right? Now, you have also another individual skill for enhancing communication. Others will be maintaining credibility, right? And being sensitive to the receivers and senders' perspectives. So an example of being sensitive to the receiver's perspective as a sender would be, for instance, if you're about to be shown something that is gory, a gory site, maybe a site where there's some form of death, right? And it's a horrible site. So you find out that whichever sender that is putting out that information, if the sender is sensitive of the recipient's perspective, right? And if the sender is equipped with good skills for enhancing communication, they will put out a disclaimer, right? Like a disclaimer telling you how horrible or how gory whatever you are about to see is, right? Viewers' discretion is advised. Those are ways of trying to be sensitive towards the receiver's perspectives. So further on the improving communication effectiveness, right? We talked about the individual skills that could enhance the communication, right? We talked about maintaining credibility, and it's all about to avoid pretending to be an expert. You should be as accurate and honest as possible. So you find out most often than not, especially when I'm asked a question, if I do not want to provide wrong answers, if I want to maintain my credibility, most often than not, rather than giving out inaccurate information or giving out an information I am not entirely sure of its accuracy, I would be like, hold on, let me confirm this information so I do not provide you the wrong information. That is in a bid to maintain my credibility as someone who passes on reliable information, right? Another individual skill will be about being sensitive to the receiver's perspective. We talked about news might be unwelcome, a surprise, or upsetting. So in such situations, you could have where things like viewers' discretion is advised, right? We already talked about that. Now, being sensitive to the sender's perspective, it will be considerate of the fact that the information might be difficult for the sender to share. So in most cases, most often than not, it's advised for the receiver not to take out their anger on or frustration on the sender. An example of that would be like when I used to work in HR, right? There are some redeployment memos that when they are being delivered to the employees, the affected employees, because they probably do not like the departments they have been sent to, or they do not want to leave the departments where they are being moved from, they do not take those news lightly, right? And most often than not, in as much as it's a decision of the top managers to go on such redeployments or to actually do such redeployments, the recipient might just take out their frustrations on the HR personnel who is delivering the memos to them, if that makes sense, right? So the sender might be in a difficult situation, so the recipient should also be sensitive of the sender's perspective as an individual skill for enhancing communication. Finally, on improving communication effectiveness, we'll be looking at the organizational skills, right, for improving communication effectiveness. You find out that organizations can use various techniques to enhance communication effectiveness, and such techniques include following up to ensure the message was received and understood, right? So follow up is about checking in later to ensure message was received and understood. Now also they could regulate information flows to avoid overload, right? So this is about taking steps to ensure overload does not occur, avoid passing too much information through the system at one time, right? Also they could understand the richness of media, right? Understanding the richness of media would be in order to choose the most appropriate media, right, for each situation. So face to face basically allows for questions and responses, right? It can allow for two-way communication effectively, right? Objective and precise messages should be in writing. So writing, having some written communication should be the appropriate medium for communication that is, or for information that is objective and precise. So like we said earlier on, that listening skill is the most important communication skill one can possess, right? So the diagram on this slide is basically illustrating more and less effective listening skills, whereby you have the more effective listening skills to the left and the flip side of it, which is the less effective listening skill to the right, on various criteria or various areas, right? So you may want to familiarize yourself with that as well.